Story number 1. The Stranger Behind the Couch. A terrifying night alone when my cousin Jeremy was just 12 years old. Something happened to him that he refuses to talk about in detail, but it's obvious it left a deep mark. It's a story that has haunted our family for years, especially when the topic comes up late at night. One evening, Jeremy was home alone. His parents had gone to dinner, and he had the house to himself. It was the early 90s, and he was watching TV in the family room. A clunky old box TV that often had signal issues. Suddenly the screen flickered and turned off. Annoyed, but not concerned, Jeremy got up and turned it back on manually, assuming it was just a glitch. But the moment he sat down again, the TV shut off once more. This strange cycle continued a few more times. But when Jeremy stood up to investigate, something felt off. He started looking for the remote, thinking it might have fallen under the couch or gotten stuck somewhere. As he knelt down to check behind the couch, Jeremy froze. There, crouched in the corner, was a man. He had disheveled hair and wore a wild expression that Jeremy would later describe as unhinged. The man was holding the TV remote in his hand, and when he noticed Jeremy, he gave him a sweet, unsettling grin. Jeremy was paralyzed for a split second, but panic took over. He bolted out of the house, screaming louder than he ever had before. He didn't stop running until he reached the neighbor's house. Thankfully, they called the police, and by the time officers arrived, the man was still inside, calmly sitting in the family room. The police arrested the man, who appeared disoriented and likely homeless. Jeremy's family never found out how he got into the house, but the story still sends shivers down my spine. Even now, Jeremy refuses to watch TV alone at night. Story number 2. The Shadow Behind the Door. When my friend Ava was a young girl, she encountered a frightening experience that still haunts her to this day. Around the age of 9, she was excitedly walking home from school, clutching her backpack and daydreaming about her favorite snacks. Her mother, a single parent, worked long hours, often returning home after Ava had settled in for the evening. As she approached the front door of their modest house, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Thinking her mother had forgotten to close it properly, she pushed it open and stepped inside. To her surprise, there stood her mother in a fluffy robe, looking pale and weary. Ava thought her mom must have taken a sick day, so she greeted her with a bright smile. However, before Ava could finish her sentence, her mother turned sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she demanded, staring directly past Ava. Confused, Ava turned around to see a shadowy figure in a long coat, swiftly retreating down the street. The man seemed to vanish into the growing darkness. As he hurried away, Ava's heart raced. She felt a chill creep up her spine as her mother moved towards her, pulling her close. "You shouldn't have opened the door. I didn't expect you home so soon," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. They quickly locked the door and checked the windows, ensuring that every entrance was secure. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Ava couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind, and her mother's worried glances didn't help either. They watched the news, and there it was, a report about a recent string of attempted break-ins in their neighborhood. That incident left a mark on both of them. Ava realized that her mother's instincts had saved her from a potentially dangerous encounter, and she never again took the safety of her home for granted. Story number 3. The Hand at the Door. Emily was just a teenager, but her life had already been marked by chaos. Her mother struggled with addiction, often leaving Emily to fend for herself. Her father, a hard-working man, tried to provide stability, but the strain was palpable. One stormy night, everything changed. Emily was asleep in her room when she was jolted awake by a series of loud thuds and scratching noises coming from her mother's bedroom. Heart racing, she heard her father's frantic footsteps as he dashed down the hallway. "What's going on?" Emily called out. But her voice was swallowed by the sound of banging. Her father pounded on the door, demanding to know what was happening inside. "Go back to sleep," her mother shouted from the other side, her voice slurred. The door finally creaked open, revealing her mother, disheveled and dazed, with no memory of the noise. Confused, her father glanced around the room, only to find the window wide open, rain pouring in. The television had been pushed across the floor, facing the outside. Fearing the worst, her father quickly locked the door and made her mother sleep on the couch in the living room. They sat together in silence, the storm raging outside, mirroring their anxiety. As the hours ticked by, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Just before dawn, Emily's father heard a peculiar shuffling noise above them, almost like footsteps on the roof. He turned to Emily, placing a finger to his lips, and they waited, breathless, until the sound finally faded away. But their relief was short-lived. Later that morning, while they were gathering their things to leave, Emily spotted something that would haunt her forever. In the hallway, at the door of an unused room, a pale finger emerged, wrapping around the edge as if beckoning her to come closer. "Dad!" she screamed, her voice trembling. He rushed to her side, and they both stared in horror as the finger slowly retreated back into the darkness of the room. Panic surged through them, and without a moment's hesitation, they fled the house. Heart pounding, they drove to a nearby gas station, trembling and waiting for Emily's grandmother to pick them up. That day, they left everything behind, never to return to that haunted house, where the past lurked in every shadow. Story number 4, The Shadow on the Edge. When Mia was 13, she lived in an old house that had seen better days. It was her sanctuary, but also a place filled with eerie memories. Her bedroom was on the top floor, isolated from the rest of the house, which often left her feeling vulnerable and anxious, especially at night. With her parents' room far below, she was used to the silence that wrapped around her like a blanket, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. One rainy evening, Mia decided to finish a book she had been reading. The clock struck 2 in the morning, and she began to feel a sense of unease creeping in. The sound of rain tapping against her window made her heart race, but she brushed it off. However, as she settled into bed, she noticed something unusual. A dark shadow creeping along the edge of her bed. Her heart skipped a beat, and she blinked hard to dispel the image, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then the shadow shifted. A rush of adrenaline coursed through her as she realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. She felt a cold draft brush against her skin, and panic set in. Gathering her courage, she flipped on her bedside lamp, illuminating the room in a warm glow. But the shadow vanished, leaving her alone with the sound of her pounding heart. Half an hour passed, and just as she began to relax, she noticed it again. This time, the shadow was closer, hovering at the foot of her bed. Trembling, Mia reached down for her water bottle, desperate for something to ground her. Instead, her hand brushed against something icy cold. Confused, she turned on the lamp again. But this time, her blood ran cold. A figure stood there, a man peering over the edge of her bed, his face obscured by the darkness. Mia screamed, a sound that echoed through the empty halls of the house, and bolted for the door, adrenaline pushing her forward. The man's hand reached out, trying to grab her, but she slipped past him and down the stairs, her heart racing with fear. Her parents were startled Awake as she burst into their room, breathless and wide-eyed, they rushed to her room, only to find it empty. The window open to the storm outside. From that night on, the memory of the shadow haunted Mia, a reminder that sometimes the darkness hides more than just silence. Story number 5, The Last Call. In a small suburban town, 16-year-old Ben was home alone on a stormy night while his parents were out at a family gathering. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of their old house, while rain lashed against the roof. Ben settled into the living room with his favorite video game, hoping to distract himself from the brewing storm. As the night wore on, the sound of thunder intensified and the power flickered. Just as he leaned back to take a break, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. He cursed under his breath and reached for his phone to call his parents. But to his surprise, there was no signal. With a sigh, he grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and made his way to the kitchen to find some candles. As he rummaged through the drawers, his phone buzzed unexpectedly. A notification popped up. Unknown caller. Thinking it was just a spam call, he ignored it. But just as he was about to light a candle, the phone buzzed again. This time he hesitated. Curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky. "Help me," a voice whispered, barely audible over the crackling line. Ben's heart raced. I'm trapped. Who is this?" he asked, feeling a cold sweat to break out across his forehead. "Just look behind you," the voice replied. Chills ran down his spine as he slowly turned, shining his flashlight into the dark corners of the room. For a moment, he saw nothing, just shadows dancing on the walls. He was about to dismiss it as a prank when he felt a cold breath on his neck. Ben spun around, heart racing, but found only empty air. Panic surged through him as he backed away toward the front door, clutching the phone tightly. The call had dropped, but the fear lingered. The candle he'd just lit flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows around the room. Just then, his phone buzzed again, and he glanced down to see another notification. Unknown caller. With shaking hands, he answered once more. "Who is this?" he demanded. "Look outside," the voice hissed, eerily calm. Against his better judgment, he approached the window, heart pounding in his chest. As he peered through the rain-smeared glass, he felt his stomach drop. There, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood a figure wearing a long coat, staring directly at him. In that instant, Ben understood. He wasn't alone after all. He dropped the phone and bolted for the door, fear propelling him forward. He fled into the stormy night, desperate to escape whatever horror awaited him inside the house. From that night on, he never returned to that place, forever haunted by the voice on the line and the shadow waiting just outside. Story number 6, The Hiker's Shadow. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a group of friends decided to embark on a weekend camping trip. Among them was Mia, a spirited adventurer with a love for the great outdoors. As they set up their tents near a serene lake, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the campsite. The group gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. As the night grew darker, Mia, feeling restless, suggested a night hike to explore a nearby trail. Her friends hesitated, but the allure of the moonlit forest was too tempting to resist. Armed with flashlights, they set off down the winding path, the sounds of the forest enveloping them. As they walked, they told ghost stories, their laughter echoing in the stillness. But soon the mood shifted. An unsettling feeling hung in the air. After about an hour, they decided to turn back. But as they retraced their steps, Mia noticed something strange. A shadow seemed to follow them, lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. She mentioned it to her friends, but they brushed it off as paranoia. However, the sensation of being watched intensified, gnawing at the edges of her mind. When they reached the campsite, relief washed over them. They settled around the fire, trying to shake off the unease. But as they began to relax, Mia glanced back at the trail. The shadowy figure stood at the tree line, unmoving. Panic coursed through her veins, and she alerted her friends, who finally turned to see what she was pointing at. "What is that?" Alex, one of the friends, whispered, squinting into the darkness. They all stood frozen, watching the figure slowly step forward into the light. It was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, with wild hair and a crazed look in his eyes. A primal fear gripped them as they realized he was not just a lost hiker. He was staring at them with an unsettling smile. In a frantic rush, they scrambled to pack their things. The man took a step closer, and without thinking, Mia grabbed her backpack and sprinted toward the road, her friends following suit. They ran until they reached the car, breathless and terrified. As they sped away, glancing back at the dark forest, Mia felt a chill settle over her. They never spoken of that night again, but the image of that man, lurking just beyond the firelight, haunted her dreams. From that day on, whenever she hiked, she always felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows, a reminder that not all wanderers belong to the light. Story number 7. The Watcher in the Woods. It was a chilly October evening when 12-year-old Sam decided to go camping in the woods behind his grandparents' house. His family had always shared stories of the forest, filled with tales of adventure and hidden treasures. But there were also whispers of strange occurrences and things that went bump in the night. Sam, however, was excited to make his own memories. He set up his small tent near a creek, the gentle sound of water easing his nerves. As darkness pulled, he lit a small fire and roasted marshmallows, savoring the warm glow and the crackling of the flames. After a while, he felt an unsettling sensation creeping in, the feeling of being watched. Shaking it off, he tried to focus on his surroundings, recalling stories about the local wildlife. Suddenly, the quiet rustling of leaves caught his attention. Peering into the darkness, he thought he saw a figure dart between the trees. Curiosity piqued, he called out, "Hello?" But only silence answered him. His heart raced, but he brushed it off as his imagination playing tricks. As the night deepened, the feeling of unease intensified. Sam decided to turn in, zipping himself into his sleeping bag, but sleep eluded him. He kept hearing faint whispers, like the wind carrying distant voices. Just as he was about to drift off, a loud thud against the side of the tent jolted him awake. Terrified, he held his breath, listening intently. Then came a low, raspy voice from outside. "Let me in, Sam." Panic surged through him. He knew that voice wasn't his grandfather's or his grandmother's. With trembling hands, he reached for his flashlight, shining it toward the tent entrance. Outside stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. "Please, I'm lost. Help me," it whispered again, a twisted grin forming beneath the darkness. Sam's instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he grabbed his backpack and bolted through the opposite side of the tent. He ran blindly into the woods, branches scratching at his arms, heart pounding like a drum. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled onto the road where his grandparents' house stood. He didn't stop running until he reached their front porch, gasping for breath. The night behind him, swallowing the darkness whole. From that night on, Sam never camped alone again, haunted by the memory of the voice that called to him in the woods. A chilling reminder that not everything lost is meant to be found. Story number 8. The dark reflection. When Mia was 12, her family moved into an old Victorian house in a quaint town known for its rich history. It was the kind of house that sparked curiosity and excitement, with creaking floors, hidden nooks, and an attic full of forgotten treasures. However, there was one particular item in the house that Mia found especially intriguing: a large, ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. The mirror had an antique frame adorned with intricate carvings, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. Mia was drawn to it, spending hours admiring her reflection. But as the days passed, she began to notice something strange. Whenever she looked into the mirror, she could see shadows moving behind her, even when the hallway was empty. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light or her imagination, but as the occurrences grew more frequent, her unease deepened. One night, after brushing her teeth, Mia found herself staring into the mirror once more. This time, the shadows seemed to take form, swirling and twisting as if they were alive. She gasped, feeling an inexplicable pull to step closer. That's when she saw it: a dark figure standing just behind her reflection, its features indistinct but unmistakably menacing. Paralyzed with fear, Mia turned around, but the hallway was empty. Heart racing, she spun back to the mirror, only to find that the figure had moved closer, now directly beside her. Panicking, she grabbed a towel and flung it over the mirror, hoping to block whatever was lurking behind the glass. That night, she barely slept, haunted by visions of the shadowy figure. The following day, Mia decided to tell her parents, but they dismissed her fears as childhood imagination. Feeling alone, she took matters into her own hands. That evening, she confronted the mirror once more, peeking beneath the towel. To her horror, the figure was gone, but a chilling whisper echoed through the hallway. "You can't hide from me." Mia couldn't take it anymore. She begged her parents to get rid of the mirror, and they reluctantly agreed. The moment it left the house, the atmosphere lifted. But late at night, when she lay in bed, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her from the shadows, waiting for the chance to return. Story number 9. The Whispering Woods. When Marco was 14, his family relocated to a rural town surrounded by thick, ominous woods. The local kids warned him about the Whispering Woods, where strange sounds were said to echo at night, and mysterious figures roamed among the trees. Dismissing their stories as mere folklore, Marco decided to explore the woods one evening, eager to prove he wasn't afraid. As dusk settled, he slipped out of the house and ventured into the forest, armed only with a flashlight. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers, reaching for the sky. Marco's heart raced, but he pressed on, the thrill of adventure overpowering his fear. As he wandered deeper, he began to hear soft whispers weaving through the air, like hushed conversations just out of reach. He halted, his skin prickling with unease. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, urging him to come closer. "Follow us," they seemed to beckon, echoing through the trees. Against his better judgment, Marco followed the sound, convinced it was just a trick of the wind. But as he moved further, the whispers shifted into a chorus of desperate cries. Panic surged within him. He turned to leave, but the path behind him had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Frantically, he shined his flashlight around, but the beam flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced in the underbrush. Just then, he spotted something. Figures emerging from the shadows, their features distorted and unnatural. They moved toward him, their mouths forming silent screams, as if pleading for help. Terrified, Marco stumbled backward, tripping over roots and scrambling to escape. The whispers intensified, filling his ears with an overwhelming cacophony. Just when he thought he would be consumed by the shadows, he broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the road, gasping for breath, his heart pounding. He glanced back at the woods, the whispers fading into the night. Marco never spoke of what he encountered in the whispering woods, but he could never shake the feeling that something dark still lurked within, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. Story number 10. The Stranger in the Reflection. Sophie had always been fascinated by old things, especially the antique mirror that hung in her grandmother's attic. It was ornate, with intricate carvings and a glass surface that seemed to shimmer with a life of its own. The moment she discovered it, she felt an inexplicable connection, as if the mirror were calling her name. One rainy afternoon, while her parents were out running errands, Sophie decided to explore the attic. The moment she stepped inside, a chill swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. She approached the mirror, brushing away layers of dust to reveal the reflection within. But when she looked closely, she noticed something strange. Her own reflection smiled back at her, even though she hadn't smiled. Confused, Sophie stepped back, only to see her reflection tilt its head to the side, mimicking her movements with a chilling precision. Heart pounding, she convinced herself it was just her imagination, but the reflection wasn't done with her yet. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sophie lay in bed, unable to shake off the unease that settled over her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the attic, jolting her awake. Curiosity piqued. She crept out of her room and made her way up the stairs. As she entered the attic, she saw the mirror glowing faintly, illuminating the space with an otherworldly light. To her horror, her reflection was no longer mimicking her. It was staring back, grinning maliciously. Sophie felt a pull, a sinister urge to reach out and touch the glass. But just as she approached, a force surged through the mirror, and her reflection reached out as if trying to escape its confines. Panic gripped her, and she stumbled backward, realizing she was no longer alone. Shadows danced around her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Terrified, Sophie bolted out of the attic, never looking back. The next morning, the mirror was gone. Shattered pieces littered the floor. Her grandmother later told her it was an old family heirloom, rumored to trap lost souls. Sophie never spoke of that night, but she always felt the shadows watching, lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for the chance to return. Thanks for the watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment below, and share it with friends and family.